I bought the land in the Oregon high desert to get away from the noise of the city, not to find something worse in the silence. It was 40 acres of sagebrush, red dust, and twisted juniper trees, completely off-grid. I lived in a renovated camper shell while I cleared the lot. My only connection to the outside world was an old, battered CB radio I kept for weather alerts. For the first month, it was dead silent. The isolation was physical. The nights were so dark you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Then I started finding things. It started small. I woke up one morning to find a heavy-duty truck battery sitting perfectly upright on my doorstep. It was brand new, expensive, the terminals still covered in plastic caps. I hadn't heard a car approach. The gravel road to my site was loud. Nobody could sneak up on me. I thought maybe a utility worker had dropped it by mistake, so I carried it half a mile to the main road and left it by the mailboxes. The next morning, the battery was back. It was sitting in the exact same spot on my step, but this time it had been wiped clean of dust. Sitting next to it was a pristine hunting knife with a bone handle. The blade was polished to a mirror shine. There was no note, just the objects, placed with terrifying precision. I felt a cold prickle on the back of my neck. I scanned the horizon with my binoculars. Nothing but heat shimmer and sagebrush. That night, the CB radio crackled to life on its own. It wasn't a weather report. The static hissed, rising and falling like breathing. Then a voice cut through, distorted and wet, sounding like someone speaking with a mouthful of water. "He didn't take the trade," the voice rasped. "Maybe he wants to be part of the trade." I froze, staring at the radio. The signal meter was pegged out to the maximum. Whoever was broadcasting wasn't in a distant town. They were within 100 yards of my camper. I grabbed my flashlight and a baseball bat, stepping out into the pitch-black night. I swept the beam across the desert floor. Shadows jumped and stretched, looking like crouching men. "Who's there?" I shouted. The silence that answered was heavy. I circled the camper, checking the dust for footprints. I found them near the back bumper. They weren't boot prints. They looked like rags had been wrapped around feet to muffle the sound. And they were everywhere. Dozens of tracks, circling the camper over and over again while I had been sleeping. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with my back to the door, listening to the wind and the occasional burst of giggling static from the radio. I drove into town the next day, shaking. The woman at the gas station went pale when I mentioned the radio traffic. She leaned over the counter and whispered about the Hill Clan, a group of squatters who had vanished into the Badlands years ago. They didn't like people buying their land. They didn't want money. They wanted to barter for things they couldn't scavenge. I bought a pump-action shotgun and drove back, determined to stand my ground. That was a mistake. 2 nights later, I woke up to a sound that made my blood freeze, the screech of metal tearing against metal. It was coming from outside, my truck. I kicked the door open, pumping the shotgun, and blinded the night with my high-powered spotlight. I expected to see junkies stripping parts. I didn't see people. I saw 3 figures standing by my truck. They were covered in ghillie suits made of old trash, gray rags, and dried sagebrush. They blended perfectly with the desert. They weren't stripping the truck. They were standing in a triangle around it, facing me. They didn't run. They didn't flinch at the light.
The radio inside my camper clicked on behind me, screaming a high-pitched feedback loop that sounded like a dying animal. The figure closest to me took a step forward. Under the rags, I saw a mask made of duct tape with holes poked for eyes. I didn't wait to shoot. I fired a warning shot into the air. They didn't even blink. The leader raised a hand, and in it was the bone-handled knife I had returned. I jumped in the truck, driving on 3 tires and a rim, tearing through the brush until I hit the highway. I never went back. The bank foreclosed on the land, but the realtor told me something strange months later. When they went to inspect the property, the camper was gone. Not stolen, disassembled. Every screw, every sheet of metal, every wire had been taken apart and vanished. They left nothing.
Loneliness does strange things to your mind, but I know what I saw. I moved to a rotting cabin in the Appalachians to write a book, thinking the isolation would spark my creativity. The woods there were dense, choking out the sunlight even at noon. My nearest neighbors were a father and son living in a dilapidated farmhouse about a mile down the hollow. The father, Mr. Henderson, was a nervous, chatty old man who would bring me jars of pickled okra. His son, Caleb, never spoke. He was a teenager, tall and gaunt, always standing just behind his father's shoulder. Caleb didn't look at people, he looked through them. Mr. Henderson always gave me the same warning: don't go wandering the ridge at night, the ground ain't stable. I thought he meant mudslides. I was wrong. About 2 months in, I started noticing small changes in my cabin. I was meticulous about my space. I'd come home from a hike and find my books rearranged by color, not messy, but perfect. Or I'd find a single wet footprint in the middle of my rug, just one, bare and muddy, with toes that looked too long. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing of value was ever taken. It was an invasion of privacy. It felt like someone was coming in just to smell the air, to touch my things. One evening, I found my toothbrush wet. I hadn't used it since morning. That night, I installed a deadbolt on the inside of the bedroom door. I confronted Mr. Henderson about it one afternoon. I found him fixing a fence. He looked terrified when I mentioned the footprint. He grabbed my arm, his grip bruising, and whispered, "I can't keep him in. The locks don't hold anymore. He likes you. He likes new things." He wouldn't explain. He just looked back at his house, where the curtains in an upstairs window were twitching. That night, a heavy storm rolled in. Thunder shook the cabin walls. I was reading by candlelight when I heard a scratching sound at my front door. It wasn't a knock. It sounded like a dog trying to dig its way in. Scratch, scratch, pause, scratch. I opened the door with a baseball bat in my hand, ready to swing. There was nothing there but the rain and the dark woods. I looked down. Sitting on the welcome mat was a mason jar. Inside the jar, floating in clear liquid, was a lock of hair. Dark hair. My hair. It had been cut from my head while I must have been sleeping. The realization made me vomit. I grabbed my keys and drove straight to the Henderson farm, angry and scared, intending to threaten them with the police.
The front door of their farmhouse was wide open, banging against the wall in the wind. I walked in. The house smelled of copper and rot. "Mr. Henderson?" I called out. My voice died in the hallway. I found Mr. Henderson in the kitchen. He had been dead for days, slumped over the table. His eyes were open, staring at the door. Written on the plastic tablecloth in what looked like charcoal was a single sentence: "Now I can come visit you." I heard a creak from the floorboards above me, footsteps, heavy, bare feet walking slowly across the ceiling, directly over my head. I didn't look for Caleb. I ran to my car and drove until I ran out of gas 3 towns over. The police said Caleb Henderson had been missing for 10 years, presumed dead in the woods. They never found anyone else in that house. But sometimes, in my new apartment in the city, I wake up and find my books rearranged, and I know he found a way to follow me.
My wife, Sarah, and I thought we were lucky finding that plot of land in Colorado. It was cheap, secluded, and beautiful. High-altitude pine forest with a view of the peaks. We were building our dream home ourselves, frame by frame, living in a tent on the weekends. The weirdness started subtly. We'd be working on the roof framing and hear a hammer banging from deep in the forest. It sounded exactly like my hammer, the same metallic ping, but it was always an echo that was a few seconds too late. I'd hit a nail, pause, and 3 seconds later, the forest would hit a nail back. We laughed about it at first, calling it the ghost carpenter. We thought it was just acoustics. But then the echo got personal. One evening, Sarah couldn't find her favorite flannel shirt. She had left it on a stump near the fire pit. We looked everywhere, assuming a raccoon had dragged it off. A week later, I was hiking the perimeter of our property to check the survey markers. I pushed through a dense thicket of spruce and found a small clearing I'd never seen before. In the center stood a scarecrow, but it wasn't made of straw. It was made of thick pine branches tied together with raw deer tendons. It was roughly the shape of a person, and it was wearing Sarah's flannel shirt. I walked up to it, my heart pounding. I touched the sleeve. The shirt was warm, not sun warm, body warm, like someone had just taken it off seconds before I arrived. I ripped the shirt off the branches and ran back to the cabin site, lungs burning. When I showed Sarah, she turned pale. "I heard you calling me from that direction an hour ago," she said. "You were yelling for help. I thought you were out there." I hadn't left the cabin site all morning. The woods weren't just echoing sounds, they were learning them. We decided to pack up immediately. We threw the tools in the back of the Jeep, the sun setting fast, casting long black shadows across the unfinished frame of the house. As we were locking the padlock on the supply shed, we heard it. From the tree line, a voice called out, "Honey, did you pack the keys?" It was my voice, perfectly mimicked. The cadence, the pitch, everything was identical. But I was standing right next to Sarah, my mouth closed. Sarah gripped my hand so hard her nails dug into my skin. Then, a second voice answered from the other side of the clearing. "Yes, I have them right here." It was Sarah's voice, flat, emotionless, like a recording being played back. We looked toward the trees. In the twilight, 2 tall, pale shapes stepped out from behind the pines. They were naked, their skin the color of birch bark. They were too tall, their limbs too long, with too many joints. They didn't have faces, just smooth, blank skin where eyes and mouths should be. They stood there, tilting their heads like birds. The one on the left opened a slit in its face, and my voice came out again, loud and distorted. "Did you pack the keys?" The one on the right mimicked Sarah's laugh. They weren't attacking, they were practicing. They were trying to become us. We jumped in the Jeep and sped off, tires spinning in the dirt. The last thing I saw in the rearview mirror were those two shapes stepping onto our driveway. They began to walk toward our unfinished house, but their gait was wrong, jerky, disjointed, lifting their legs too high. We never sold the land, we just abandoned it. I don't want anyone else going up there and giving those things a new voice to learn.